"Hey, sir, you dropped this." Those were the 5 words a 12-year-old boy in a jacket 2 sizes too small spoke through the cracked back window of a long black sedan on the corner of Adams and Canal on a Thursday evening in December. And the old man inside the car, who had not been spoken to with that particular tone of breathless honesty in almost 40 years, would later say that he heard the voice before he saw the face. The voice came first. The voice was what he remembered. A small, winded, careful voice, the kind that had been practicing politeness the way other children practice piano, and it reached him through the half-inch of open glass like something the wind itself had carried up to the door of his car and left there. He turned his head. He saw a hand. A small hand, red at the knuckles, the nails bitten down to the quick, holding out a thick black leather wallet with both gloves-less fingers wrapped carefully around the edges so it would not slip. And behind the hand he saw the face. A boy. A small black boy with eyes the color of strong coffee, breath coming in clouds, water from the slush soaking the legs of jeans that did not fit him, mouth set in a tight line that was trying very hard not to look like it had just run 4 blocks at full speed. The man in the back of the car was named Walter Hayes. He was 73 years old. He had built over the course of 51 years, beginning with a single small commercial real estate firm on the South Side, and a loan from his late wife's father that he had repaid in 18 months. A company that now owned more square feet of downtown Chicago than any other privately held firm in the state. He was, by the most conservative estimate in the most recent profile that had been written about him in the Tribune, worth somewhere north of $1.5 billion. He did not know in that first half-second of looking at the boy through the window of his car that any of those facts mattered to the story that was about to begin. He only knew that his wallet, which he had not yet realized was gone, was being held out to him by a child who had run hard enough to catch a moving vehicle in evening traffic, and who was now standing on the curb, shaking from the cold, waiting to give it back. Before we go any further, take a second and leave a comment letting me know where in the world you are watching from tonight. And if stories about quiet honesty in a loud world mean something to you, hit subscribe so the next one finds its way to you. Chicago in the second week of December had a kind of cold that the people who lived there had developed 20 different words for, and the people who visited there had only one. The wind that night was the bad kind, the kind that came down off the lake and turned the corner at Adams Street with its teeth out, and it had been pushing pedestrians sideways along the sidewalks outside Union Station since about 3 in the afternoon. The clouds had been low and bruised-looking all day. The forecast had promised snow by midnight. The kind of Thursday, in other words, when most people had their heads down and their collars up and their thoughts already at home where it was warm, which was why no one else in the moving river of commuters outside the Adams Street exit had seen the wallet fall, or had bothered to look up when a small, thin boy darted off the curb and started running after a black car that was already a half block ahead in traffic. Micah Reeves had not been planning to run anywhere that evening. He had been planning, in the careful and small way he planned everything now, to spend the next 40 minutes inside the heated waiting area of the station, sitting on the long wooden bench at the back wall, with his backpack between his feet and his school library copy of Hatchet open on his lap, until the security guard on the Thursday shift, a tired man named Reggie who pretended not to notice the same skinny kid sitting in the same corner 3 nights a week, started his slow walkthrough telling the late stragglers it was time to find somewhere else to be. That was the plan. It had been the plan for 11 days, ever since the night Micah had come home to a padlocked door and a stranger on the steps and a mother whose phone had stopped working sometime between dinner and dawn. He had been on his own since the 18th of November. He kept track in the back of his notebook with a small pencil mark for each day, the way prisoners in old movies kept track on the walls of their cells, because keeping track was a thing he had decided early on that he was going to do, and small decisions were the only kind he had any control over anymore. His father, a long-haul truck driver named Marcus Reeves, who had laughed loudly and sung in the car badly, and called him little man from the time he was old enough to walk, had died of a cancer that had come fast and taken its time at the same time, the way some cancers do, ending in a hospice room on a hot June afternoon with the windows open, and a fan running and Micah holding his hand, and not crying because his father had asked him 2 days before not to cry until afterward. He had kept that promise. He had cried afterward. He had cried for almost a week, and then he had stopped because his mother had started and she had not stopped, and there had not been room in the small apartment they had moved into after the medical bills for 2 people to be falling apart at the same time. His mother was not a bad woman. Micah needed to be clear about that, even in the quiet country of his own head, because the world had a way of telling stories about women like his mother that left out the parts that mattered. She had been a school cafeteria manager for 16 years. She had braided his hair when he was small and sung his "Eye is on the Sparrow" off-key at the kitchen sink when she did the dishes, and she had loved his father with the kind of love that, when it was taken away, had left a wound she did not know how to bandage. She had started drinking sometime in the late summer. She had lost the cafeteria job in early October. The man on the front steps the night of November the 18th, the one with the cigarette and the cold, flat eyes, was not someone Micah had ever seen before, and the only thing his mother had said to him on the phone before her number stopped working 2 days later was, "Baby, you stay with your auntie until I call you. I am going to fix this. I promise I am going to fix this." She had not called. He had stayed with his aunt in Joliet for 9 days before his aunt's boyfriend had decided that 9 days was 8 too many, and Micah had taken the metro back into the city with the last $14 in his backpack and had been walking ever since. He did not think of himself as homeless. That was an important distinction that he made carefully inside his own head, because homeless was a word that belonged to the men he saw sleeping in the doorways of closed dry cleaners along Halsted, the men whose eyes had gone somewhere far away that they could not always find their way back from, and Micah was not one of them yet. He was, he told himself, between places. He was waiting. He was waiting for his mother to call. He was waiting for the social worker his school counselor had mentioned the previous spring. He was waiting for the kind of thing that he could feel coming even if he could not yet name it. The waiting required money he did not have, and food he could mostly only find at the soup line on Wabash that ran on Tuesdays and Saturdays, and a place to sit out the worst of each evening that did not cost anything and did not ask him questions. Union Station was the best of those places. The waiting area was warm. The ceiling was high enough that he could look up at the brass clock and the carved stone and feel, for a few minutes at a time, like he was inside something built to last, like he was a small temporary thing in the middle of something permanent, and there was a comfort in that he could not have explained to anyone but had come to depend on. The bench at the back wall did not have armrests, which meant a person could lean against it sideways for a long time without anyone telling them to sit up straight. The bathroom downstairs had hand dryers a person could stand in front of for 2 full minutes before the noise got embarrassing. And Reggie, the security guard on Thursdays, did not bother him, which was the highest courtesy one human being could pay another in a city like Chicago in a December like this one. That was where he had been headed when he saw Walter Hayes for the first time. He had come up the wide marble staircase from the lower platforms about 10 minutes past 5, his hands jammed into the pockets of his jacket, and his backpack hooked over only one shoulder because the other strap had finally torn through that morning, and he had not yet figured out what to do about it. The evening rush was at its loudest. The great hall of the station was full of the particular sound 1,000 people make when they are all in a hurry, but trying not to look like they are. The soft clatter of suitcase wheels on stone, the rapid percussion of dress shoes, the long echoing announcements coming down from speakers somewhere above the chandeliers. Micah had pressed himself against the side of the staircase, the way he had taught himself to do, making his small body smaller, letting the river of commuters move past him without touching him, and he had watched, as he always watched, because watching was what kept a person safe. That was when he had first seen the old man in the long black overcoat. The man had come down the corridor from the direction of the metro platforms with the slow and deliberate pace of someone who was not in any hurry, which was, by itself, an unusual enough thing inside Union Station at 5 in the evening that Micah's eyes had snagged on him. He was tall. He had the kind of straight back that men of a certain age either kept until the end of their lives or lost entirely. His face was long and lined and the color of weathered oak, with a neat white mustache and white hair cut close beneath a soft gray fedora, and he carried a small worn leather briefcase in his left hand and nothing else. Everything about him, Micah had noticed in the half-second it took to see and catalog him, was expensive in the quiet way that very expensive things sometimes were. Nothing shiny, nothing new. Just the kind of careful, dark, lived-in quality that belonged to a person who had stopped needing to prove anything to anyone a long time ago. The old man had walked across the great hall toward the Adams Street exit, and as he passed the bench just inside the bank of brass doors, the bench where a woman Micah had seen many times before was sitting with her cardboard sign and a paper coffee cup at her feet. He had slowed. He had set the briefcase down. He had reached inside his coat, past the burgundy scarf and into the inside pocket where his wallet lived, and he had drawn out the wallet, and from it a single folded bill, and he had bent down at the waist with the small, careful effort old men make when they bend. And he had placed the bill not into the coffee cup, but into the woman's hand, and he had closed her fingers around it the way you close a child's fingers around something they might drop. He had said something to her. Micah was too far away to hear what. The woman had looked up at him, and her face had done something Micah did not have a word for at the time, but would later understand, was the look of a person being seen for the first time in a long time, and the old man had nodded once and straightened up and picked up his briefcase and turned back toward the doors. That was the moment. In the small, efficient motion of returning the wallet to his coat, the old man had not noticed that the inside pocket of his overcoat, where the wallet usually rested, was slightly twisted under the line of his scarf. The wallet, which he had set there without looking, had not slid into the deep silk-lined pouch where it had ridden every day for the better part of 15 years. It had settled instead into a shallow, open fold at the very top of the pocket, held in place by nothing more than the friction of cloth on leather, and Micah, standing 20 feet away with the same watchfulness he brought to every grown-up he passed, had seen it. He had seen the fold. He had seen the wallet sitting wrong. He had felt, somewhere in his chest, the small, uneasy click of a thing that was about to go badly. He had thought in the same instant about calling out, "Sir, your pocket," but the words had not come. They had stuck in his throat the way most words to strangers stuck in his throat now, because sir was a word that belonged to boys who had homes, and the old man was already moving, already pushing through the heavy brass doors out into the wind. Micah had followed at a distance of maybe 10 feet, not because he had decided to follow, but because some quieter part of him had decided for him, and his feet had simply gone where the decision pointed. The brass doors had still been swinging when he pushed through them, and the wind on the other side had hit him so hard he had to duck his face into the collar of his jacket and squint to keep his eyes from watering. The sidewalk outside the Adams Street exit was crowded the way it always was at that hour, with men and women in long dark coats moving in two opposing rivers, and Micah had to weave through them, half running already, his small shoulder catching the elbow of a man in a gray suit who did not look down to see who had bumped him. He saw the old man reach the curb. He saw him lift a gloved hand, the smallest possible gesture, the kind of signal a person uses when they know that whoever they are signaling has been watching for them. He saw the long black car ease forward from a few spaces down the curb to meet him, the way black cars in that part of the city always seemed to know when to come and when to wait. The driver, a heavy-set man in a dark wool coat, had stepped out from the front and was already opening the rear passenger door, and the old man had nodded a small thank you and bent his head to climb inside. And there, right there, in the small angled motion of bending his head and folding himself into the back seat, the lapel of the long black overcoat had pulled forward, and the shallow fold of the pocket had pulled with it, and the wallet, which had been waiting all those long seconds to fall, had finally fallen. It had dropped from the height of about 3 feet onto the wet concrete of the curb, and it had landed flat, with the soft, heavy sound that thick leather makes against wet stone, the kind of sound that does not carry more than 4 or 5 feet on a quiet day and certainly did not carry against the wind that evening. The driver had not heard it. The old man, already inside the car, had not heard it. The car door had closed with a soft thunk. The driver had walked around the front of the car with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had been doing the same job a long time and slid into his seat and put the car in gear. Micah had been 20 feet away. He had not thought. He did not have time to think. He had moved the way the body moves when the mind has not yet caught up, and his 2 big sneakers had slapped through a half-frozen puddle, and he had bent at the curb and picked up the wallet, and the leather of it was still warm from the inside pocket of the old man's coat, and he had not even fully straightened before he was running. The car had pulled out into Adams Street and merged into the slow procession of evening traffic, taillights red in the gathering dark, and Micah had run after it, the wallet pressed flat against his chest with both hands, his lungs already burning from the cold air, his backpack bouncing hard against the small of his back where the broken strap let it swing. He ran past the long row of newspaper boxes outside the station. He ran past a woman selling roasted nuts from a metal cart who looked at him sharply as he went by, the way adults sometimes looked at running children in cities like Chicago, because a running child was almost always either being chased or chasing. He ran past 2 businessmen sharing a cigarette outside the lobby of the building on the corner of Adams and Canal, and one of them said something he did not catch, and he did not turn his head to see what. The car was at the light at Canal Street now, third in a line of 4. The light was red. Micah ran faster. He reached the rear bumper just as the light turned green, and for a horrible half-second he thought the car would pull away from him and he would lose it forever, and the wallet pressed against his ribs felt suddenly impossibly heavy, the weight of every chance he had not yet been given. But the car ahead of it did not move fast enough, and the black sedan rolled forward only 6 or 7 feet before braking again, and Micah reached the back window on the passenger side and pressed his small red knuckles against the cold glass and called out, in a voice already half broken by the running, the words he would not remember saying. "Sir, sir, you dropped this." Walter Hayes had been settling into the leather seat with the slow gratitude of a man whose knees had been hurting since lunch when the small voice came through the cracked window. He had not heard it at first, or rather he had heard it the way old men hear most things at the end of a long day, as a sound that registered without yet becoming words. And it was only when the voice came a second time, a little louder, a little more out of breath, that the words assembled themselves in his mind, and he understood, with the sudden quickening of all his old attention, that someone outside the car was speaking directly to him. He turned his head. The driver, a man named Theodore who had been driving for him for 19 years and who could read his employer's smallest motions with the accuracy of long marriage, was already easing the car back into park with one hand and reaching for the button that controlled the rear window with the other. Walter raised a single gloved finger from his lap, a small private signal, and Theodore left the window where it was, only cracked an inch, and waited. The car ahead of them moved through the green light. The horn of the car behind them gave a short, polite tap. Theodore did not move. Walter looked through the glass. He saw a boy, a small boy, 12, maybe 13 if he was 13 at all, with a face that had the particular thinness that childhood faces did not get from genetics, and skin that had gone a chapped pinkish gray across the cheekbones from the cold. He saw a jacket that was at least 2 seasons past being warm enough for that kind of weather, the cuffs frayed where the boy's wrists came through, the zipper missing a tooth halfway up. He saw a backpack hanging off one shoulder by a single strap. He saw the boy's hand pressed against the window, the knuckles split and red, and he saw what the hand was holding, and he understood in the same second that he had not noticed the wallet was gone. He did not move quickly. He had learned a long time ago that quick motions in the presence of a frightened thing, animal or child or grown person, almost always ended the conversation before it began. He turned his body slowly toward the door. He met the boy's eyes through the glass. He nodded very slightly, the smallest possible acknowledgement, the kind of nod that said, "I see you and I am not going to do anything sudden," and then he reached over with his gloved hand and pressed the small silver button on the armrest, and the window rolled the rest of the way down. The wind from the street came into the car. The boy's breath came into the car with it, in small, visible clouds. Walter could smell the cold on him, that particular outdoor smell of damp wool and exhaust and skin that has not been warm in a long time, a smell that came back to Walter from a place in his own past that he did not visit often. "Young man," Walter said. His voice was low and dry and unhurried, the voice of a man who had spent 50 years learning that most situations did not get better when you raised your voice. "Am I to understand that I dropped that?" "Yes, sir," Micah said. He was still breathing hard. He held the wallet out a little farther, as if afraid that the longer he held it, the more it might look like he was thinking of keeping it. "On the sidewalk, when you got in the car, I tried to call you, but you did not hear me, so I ran." He paused. He swallowed. He added, because he had been raised to add it, "I did not look inside." Walter took the wallet. He took it slowly, and with both hands the way he would have taken a small bird, and he held it for a moment in his lap without opening it. He looked at the boy. He looked at the boy's eyes, which were steady on his face, not on the wallet, not on the inside of the car, not on any of the things a child looking to gain something might have looked at. He looked at the way the boy was standing on the curb, slightly bent forward, slightly favoring one leg, the way a small body stands when it has been running on a stomach that has not had enough to eat in a while. "You ran how far?" Walter asked. "From the station, sir. From the doors. From the curb outside the doors, sir, down to the light." Walter was quiet for a long second. He looked once at Theodore in the rearview mirror. Theodore's eyes met his and held them. "What is your name, young man?" "Micah, sir, Micah Reeves." Walter let the name sit in the warm air of the car for a small moment before he said anything back, the way he had let names sit for the better part of 7 decades, because names, he had decided a long time ago, were the only thing most people gave you for free, and they deserved to be received with the small ceremony of a held breath. "Micah," he said. That is from the Hebrew. It means who is like the Lord. Did you know that? My father told me, sir. The small past tense did not move across Micah's face, but Walter, who had spent a lifetime listening to the things people did not quite say, heard it land the way a snowflake lands on water. He did not lean toward it. He did not lean away. He simply nodded once, and the nod was its own kind of answer. Mr. Reeves, Walter said. The name came out with the same careful weight he gave the names of men in his own boardroom, no warmer and no colder. And Micah felt the strangeness of being called Mr. Anything settle into his small chest, with the surprising warmth of a thing he had not known he was hungry for. I am going to ask you a question, and I would like you to answer it truthfully. Were you waiting on that sidewalk for me specifically? No, sir. You did not follow me out from the station with the intention of speaking to me? No, sir. I saw your pocket was open, but I did not say anything because I did not want to be in the way. And then the wallet fell, and you got in the car, and I ran because the car was leaving. Walter looked at him for a long second. Then he did something he very rarely did with strangers on the street and almost never did with children. He opened the wallet. He did it slowly in the boy's plain sight, with his gloved fingers folding back the leather the way a man opens an envelope he already knows the contents of. There was a thin stack of bills inside, the kind of stack that a person who had been hungry for 11 days would have noticed without meaning to. There were 3 credit cards. There was a driver's license with a photograph on it of a younger version of the same face. And there, tucked behind a small clear plastic window in the side panel, was a folded photograph, edges soft with handling, of a woman with gray hair and very dark eyes sitting in a garden somewhere with the light behind her. Walter looked at the photograph for one short second. Then he folded the wallet closed. He had done this, Micah understood watching him, not to check whether anything was missing. He had done it so that the boy could see, in the moment of the wallet's return, that the man was not the kind of man who would later accuse him of taking something that he had not taken. It was the closest thing to a private courtesy Walter Hayes was capable of paying a stranger, and it was not lost on Micah, who had spent the last 3 weeks being looked at in ways that started with the assumption that he had already done something wrong. Mr. Reeves, Walter said, slipping the wallet not into the outer pocket this time, but deep into the inside one, against the silk lining where it belonged. I am not going to insult you by trying to pay you for what you have just done. You did not do it for that reason, and we both know it. He paused, but I have been around a long time, and I have learned that there is almost nothing in the world more rare than the thing you just did, and I would be a poor sort of man if I let you simply turn around and walk back into that wind without at least asking you something. Sir, have you had your supper tonight? The question was so gentle that it took Micah a half-second to feel the edge of it. He looked at the old man's face. He looked at the watery clarity of the eyes. He looked at the gloved hands folded in the lap and the burgundy scarf and the careful patience of a person who was not going to rush him no matter how long he took to answer. He thought briefly about lying. He thought about saying, yes, sir, I ate already, the way he had said it to 100 people in the last 3 weeks, because lying was sometimes the only door that did not lead somewhere worse. But there was something about Walter Hayes that did not allow that particular lie to form in his mouth. No, sir, he said quietly, not tonight. Yesterday? Micah did not answer. Walter did not press the silence. He let it sit between them the way a candle sits between 2 people at a small table, lighting them without asking anything of them. Outside the car, the wind had picked up again, and a sheet of newspaper went tumbling past the curb in long, slow somersaults, the way newspapers had been tumbling past curbs in that city for 100 years. The light at Canal Street cycled green, then yellow, then red again. The car behind them, which had given up honking, eased around them and merged back into traffic with a small, irritable swerve. Theodore in the front seat kept his hands on the wheel and his eyes forward, and his face perfectly still. The way Theodore had learned to keep his face still in moments like this one. Because Theodore had been driving Walter Hayes for 19 years, and Theodore knew, the way a man knows the weather of his own roof, that something was about to happen that he would not be telling his wife about over the dinner table for many years to come. Mr. Reeves, Walter said, and the formal name came again, deliberate and offering. I am going to make you an offer, and I want you to know before I make it that you are free to say no. The car will take you wherever you ask it to take me. No questions, no conditions. You may simply step away from this window right now and walk back to the station, and Theodore and I will drive home, and that will be the end of it, and I will think of you with respect for the rest of my life, regardless of what you choose. Do you understand me? Yes, sir. Good, the offer is this. I am on my way home, but I have not eaten supper either, and there is a small place I sometimes stop at on the way that is about 10 minutes from here. The food is plain. The woman who runs it has known me a long time. There are no other diners at this hour because it is too early for the kind of people who eat there, and we will not be bothered. I would like to take you to that place, and I would like to eat supper with you, and I would like, while we eat, to ask you some questions that I think you and I both already know the shape of." He paused. The wind moved a strand of his white hair against the brim of the fedora. "After supper, if you would like Theodore to drive you somewhere, he will. If you would like to be dropped back at the station, he will. There will be no obligation in either direction. I am asking you because I am hungry and I would prefer not to eat alone tonight, and I think perhaps you might prefer the same." Micah stood on the curb with the wind pushing at the back of his too small jacket and his red knuckles white now around the strap of his backpack. He looked at Walter. He looked at Theodore's careful, still face in the front seat. He looked at the warm, yellow interior of the long black car, the soft glow of the small reading lamp set into the panel above the back seat, the rich brown of the leather, the strange, impossible warmth of a small, enclosed space on a very cold December evening. He thought about Reggie the security guard, who would be starting his slow walkthrough in about an hour. He thought about the bench at the back wall. He thought about the long stretch of night that came after the station closed, the long stretch of hours when there was nowhere to be that did not cost something he did not have. He thought about his father, who had told him once, sitting on the front step of their old apartment on a summer evening with a sweating glass of iced tea in his hand, that the only mistake you ever really made in life was the one where you let pride keep you cold when somebody honest was offering you a fire. "Yes, sir," Micah said. His voice was very small. "I would like that, thank you, sir." Walter nodded once. He did not smile. He did not make any of the small, theatrical gestures that adults sometimes made when a child accepted a thing they had clearly needed. He simply turned his head slightly and said, in a voice that did not have to be raised inside the car, "Theodore, would you mind?" And Theodore, who had been waiting 19 years for moments very much like this one, slid out of the front seat without a word and walked around the back of the car and opened the rear passenger door on the curbside, and stood there with the same quiet patience he might have used to hold a door for a senator. "Get in out of the wind, Mr. Reeves," Walter said. Micah climbed into the car the way a person climbs into something they have only ever seen from the outside, slowly, and with both hands and a small, involuntary held breath. The seat was wider than the bench at the back of his grandmother's church. The leather was warm from the heater, and the warmth came up through his jeans and into the back of his legs and into the small of his back where the cold had settled deepest, and he had to set his teeth against the strange, sudden ache that came with returning warmth, the ache that meant his body had been holding the cold longer than he had let himself notice. He set the backpack on his lap. He folded his hands on top of it. He did not lean back against the seat because leaning back felt like a thing he had not yet earned. Walter Hayes did not look at him. That was the second great kindness of the evening after the opening of the wallet. Walter kept his eyes forward through the windshield as Theodore eased the car back into traffic, and he made a small, unhurried observation about the way the snow had been promised for hours and still had not arrived, the way a man speaks to fill a small space without asking it to give anything back. Micah listened to the voice the way he might have listened to a radio left on for company. He did not have to answer. He was being allowed, in the warm dark of the back seat of a stranger's car, to simply be still. They drove south on Canal, and then west on a street Micah did not know the name of, past buildings that gave way slowly from glass and steel to brick and brick to the older blocks, where the lights from the storefronts spilled yellow onto the sidewalks, the way light had spilled in the city for 100 years. The car rode so quietly that Micah could hear, very faintly, the small ticking of his own breath against the cold glass of the window, and he had to remind himself a few times that he was awake. The restaurant was on a short street between a hardware store and a closed flower shop. There was no sign over the door, only a small painted name in the lower corner of the window, in gold letters that had been painted by hand a long time ago and touched up by the same hand a few times since. Meyerill's. Theodore eased the car to the curb and got out and opened the rear door, and Walter climbed out first, the slow, careful unfolding of an old man's body in the cold, and then Micah followed, holding his backpack against his chest. The wind found him again as soon as he was on the sidewalk. He had only been warm for 10 minutes, and the cold felt worse now than it had before. Walter laid one gloved hand very lightly on his shoulder as they walked the few steps to the door. The hand did not push, it did not steer, It only rested there long enough for the boy to feel it, and then it lifted again, and Walter opened the door for him and stood aside, and Micah, who had never had a door opened for him by a grown man in his life, walked through it. Inside, the room was small and dim and smelled of butter and onions and slow bread. There were 8 tables. 6 of them were empty. The other 2 were set but uneaten at. A woman in her 60s came out from a doorway at the back with a dish towel over one shoulder, and her face, which had been arranged for the small business of an early evening, rearranged itself entirely when she saw who had come through the door. "Walter," she said. She had a small accent that was hard to place, the kind that had been softened by a long time in a country that was not the country it had started in. She crossed the room with her hand already out, and Walter took it and held it and said, "Myril, I have brought a guest tonight. This is Mr. Reeves. He has done me a very large kindness, and I am repaying him with one of your suppers, which is hardly enough, but it is what I have." Myril looked down at Micah. She did not bend at the waist the way some grown-ups bent when they spoke to children, the way that made a child feel like a small animal in a zoo. She lowered herself slowly into a crouch instead, so that her face was level with his, and she put out her hand, palm up, the way you offer a hand to someone whose handshake you want and will wait to be given. "Mr. Reeves," she said, "I am Myril. Welcome to my kitchen." Micah did not know what to do with the offered hand. He had not shaken many hands in his life, and certainly not with women in restaurants who treated him as if he were a man with somewhere to be. He took it after a half-second of hesitation, and her grip was warm and dry and firm in a way that did not test him, and she held his hand for a moment longer than the simple shape of a handshake required, and then she let it go and stood and gestured them toward a small table near the window. The tablecloth was plain white. The water glasses were already on the table, and a single small candle in the middle that Myril leaned over and lit with a wooden match. Walter eased himself into the chair across from Micah with a small sigh that he tried, unsuccessfully, to keep to himself. He hung his fedora on the brass hook on the wall beside him. He folded his gloves and laid them flat on the windowsill. Myril brought a basket of bread without being asked and set it down in the middle of the table, and Walter tore a piece of it slowly and pushed the basket gently across to Micah and said only in a low voice that did not make a ceremony of it, "She brings more if you finish that. There is no end to the bread here. I have tested it many times." Micah reached for a piece. His hand was steadier now in the warmth of the room, but only by a small margin. He tore the bread the careful way he had been taught to tear bread, and he put a piece of it in his mouth, and the taste of it, warm and slightly sweet and made by the hands of someone who had been making bread for a long time, went into him like a key going into a lock he had not known was inside his chest. He did not cry. He had made a promise to himself a long time ago about not crying in front of grown men in unfamiliar rooms. But his eyes burned, and he kept them on the tablecloth, and he chewed slowly, and Walter, who could see all of it and had the grace not to see any of it, turned his face slightly toward the window and began to speak of small, unconnected things. Myril brought soup, then a plate of chicken with potatoes and a green vegetable that Micah did not know the name of, cooked in butter and lemon. She brought a small glass of milk for Micah and a cup of black coffee for Walter, and she did not hover, and she did not refill water glasses that did not need refilling, and she did not ask either of them a single question. She moved through the small room the way Anna had moved through hers in another city in another decade, the way certain women moved through rooms when they had decided long ago that the people at their tables were not customers but guests. Halfway through the chicken, Walter set down his fork. He folded his hands in front of him on the white cloth. He looked at the boy across from him, and his pale eyes were very steady. "Mr. Reeves," he said, "I am going to tell you something that very few people in this city know about me, and I am going to tell it to you because I think you are owed it." Micah looked up. "When I was 11 years old," Walter said, "I lived with my mother in a single rented room above a tailor's shop on the south side. My father had been killed 2 years before that in an accident at the steel mill where he worked. My mother took in laundry. There were weeks when there was not enough to eat, and on one of those weeks, in a January almost 60 years ago, I walked 5 blocks in a coat that did not fit me to a corner store run by a man named Mr. Abernathy, and I picked up a loaf of bread off the rack by the door, and I walked out without paying for it because there was nothing in my pockets and my mother had not eaten in 2 days. He paused. Mr. Abernathy followed me down the sidewalk. He caught up to me at the end of the block. He did not yell. He did not call the police. He took me by the shoulder, very gently, and he turned me around, and he walked me back to his store, and he sat me down on a crate behind the counter, and he made me a sandwich out of that same loaf of bread, and he asked me what my mother's name was, And the next morning there was a box of groceries on our doorstep. And there was a box of groceries on our doorstep every Tuesday for the next 4 years until I was old enough to work. Walter's voice did not change. What you did for me tonight, Mr. Reeves, is what Mr. Abernathy did for me a long time ago. Micah did not know what to say to that. He had never been told a story by a grown man as if the story belonged equally to both of them. He sat very still with the fork resting in his hand, and Walter, who did not require him to say anything, picked up his own fork and went back to his supper. And the conversation continued in the small, ordinary way of suppers everywhere, about the bread and the weather and the long-standing argument Myril and Walter had been having for 9 years about whether her potatoes were better with rosemary or with thyme. By the time the plates were cleared and a small bowl of vanilla ice cream had appeared in front of Micah without anyone asking him if he wanted it, the boy had begun, in a slow, careful way, to talk. He told Walter about his father. He told him about his mother. He told him in pieces about the padlocked door and the stay in Joliet and the 3 weeks of walking, and Walter listened the way the right people listen, without interrupting and without flinching and without looking at any moment like he was already thinking about what he was going to do about it. He listened the whole way through, and when Micah had finished, Walter took a slow sip of his coffee and set the cup down and said only, "Thank you for telling me, Mr. Reeves." That cannot have been easy. Outside the small front window of Myril's, the snow had finally begun. It came down in the slow, heavy flakes of a long night, the kind of snow that makes a city quieter for a few hours before the plows arrive, and the streetlight on the corner of the block had turned the air silver. Walter folded his napkin. He looked at Micah across the table, and he made the offer plainly, the way he had made every important offer of his long life. There was a house. There was a guest room with clean sheets and a door that locked from the inside. There was a woman named Geraldine who kept the house and who would be glad of someone to fuss over for a change. There was no obligation. There was, Walter said, only a question of what the boy preferred for tonight, and what the two of them, together with the right people, would begin to sort out in the morning. Micah said yes. The drive out to the house took 35 minutes, north along streets that gave way slowly from city to suburb to a quiet road lined with old trees. And somewhere along that road Micah fell asleep against the warm leather of the door, the way exhausted children sometimes fall asleep in the back seats of cars when their bodies finally trust that they have arrived somewhere safe enough to do it. Theodore lifted him from the car when they reached the house, and carried him inside the way he had carried his own children 20 years before. And Geraldine, who had been told nothing by telephone, but who had been working for Walter Hayes long enough to recognize the shape of a long night when it arrived at her front door, had a bed already turned down in the small first-floor guest room, and a glass of water on the nightstand, and a small lamp left on so the boy would not wake confused in the dark. The story did not become a viral video. There were no cameras on the corner of Adams and Canal that evening, and the only people who knew for a long time were Walter and Theodore and Geraldine and Myril, and that was the way Walter wanted it. Through the long, quiet work of lawyers and social workers and a great deal of patience, Micah was returned to a stable life. His grandmother in St. Louis, who had been looking for him for months and had not been told where he had gone, was found within a week. His mother, whom Walter never spoke about with anything less than dignity, was helped into a treatment program that, in time and with many setbacks, she finished. Micah lived in the house on the quiet road on and off for most of his teenage years. He graduated from a school where he was allowed to be quiet. He went to college on a scholarship Walter had quietly arranged. Walter Hayes died at the age of 86 in the same house on a clear morning in March, with Geraldine holding one of his hands and Micah, then 25 and home from his second year of graduate school, holding the other. In the desk drawer in Walter's study, there was a sealed envelope addressed in his careful handwriting to Mr. Reeves. Inside it was a single sheet of paper that said, "You ran 4 blocks in the cold to give back something that was not yours. That is the whole of it. Be the man who runs." Micah Reeves is 41 years old now. He runs a nonprofit in Chicago that finds children who are between places, the way he was once between places, and gives them a door that locks from the inside. He named the foundation after a man on the South Side who once made a sandwich out of a stolen loaf of bread for a hungry boy who would grow up to remember it. He called it the Abernathy Project. If this story moved you tonight, leave a comment and tell me which part stayed with you, and subscribe for more stories of quiet honesty and second chances. Thank you for being here.